Thank you to the Research Institute for Bilingual Learning and Teaching at Hong Kong Metropolitan University for inviting me to give this webinar. As Emily said, my name is Ben Rowlett from the English department at BU. So in this talk, I'm going to be framing studies in the social domain of language learning, gender, and sexuality via a queer applied linguistics approach, and in the process putting forward a case for the queering of applied linguistics. So a brief overview of what I'm going to talk about in this session. So I'm going to start by defining some terms, namely what is applied linguistics, and then the approaches of what we might call a critical applied linguistics. I'll then give an outline of some of the concerns related to studies of language learning and gender before going on to discuss what is meant by engaging with the queer in applied linguistics, along with related concepts, of course, of queer theory, queer linguistics, and ultimately conceptions of what a queer applied linguistics might be. I'll then present a case study from my research in Cambodia. And in this research, I took a queer applied linguistic approach to the second language socialization paradigm. And I'll end with some thoughts about queering applied linguistics in general and some ways forward for this approach. Okay, so I'm assuming that many of you who are here probably have an understanding of what applied linguistics is. So I'm not going to spend too much time explaining this here. Suffice to say that there have been multiple definitions of this discipline over the years, but most seem to be in agreement that applied linguistics is a practice-driven discipline that addresses language-based problems in real-world contexts, taking a definition here from the Oxford Handbook of Applied Linguistics. So that means that research in applied linguistics encompasses topics such as language use, language evaluation, language contact, multilingualism, language policies, and language learning and education, which is our main focus for today. Now, in recent decades, a number of scholars have put forward the case for a critical applied linguistics, and in which the main driving factor behind the research has been, in the words of Alistair Pennycook, to connect the local conditions of language to broader social formations. So in effect, this means that applied linguistics should, or more importantly, needs to pay attention to issues of power and inequality, such as those related to concepts of race, gender, sexuality, social class, to name but a few. So in the light of this drive to harness a more critical approach in applied linguistics, and especially in the social domain of language learning and teaching, recent years have seen quite a number of studies focus on gender and more recently sexuality, which of course both are intertwined social concepts, in order to address how these social categories impact language learning processes in a variety of contexts. And this is both inside and outside of the classroom, in terms of things like positioning, access to linguistic resources, and learner investment and agency. And these studies have contributed to revealing how discursive practices related to gender in the classroom and beyond can either empower or conversely marginalize or alienate students from language learning. Importantly, the approaches taken here focus on highly contextualized local settings, in contrast to the kind of broader kind of comparative research that's attempted to produce quantifiable measurements that account for males and females' differing learning trajectories. So some notable studies very briefly in this area, one of which is Carr and Pulse in Australia. And they looked at the differing motivations vis-a-vis second language learning between boys and girls in a secondary school in Australia, of course, identifying a discourse in this case where real boys, i.e. masculine performing boys as opposed to nerds, don't do languages. And in the US, Maynard Warwick studied classroom learning activities for Latina migrants to the US. So the classroom materials and interactions with the teacher position these women into socially recognized roles based on their ethnicity and gender, such as domestic worker or factory worker, and in this way effectively silencing the development of an L2 voice for some of the participants who may have wished to be positioned otherwise. And finally, and a personal favorite of mine, is Kimie Takahashi's study of female Japanese students studying abroad. And in this study, Takahashi looks at how Japanese women invest in language learning through articulations of desire. So these women, by studying abroad in Western countries and the way these opportunities are represented in the media, and you'll see there's a little image of a magazine about study abroad here from Japan. So the way these opportunities are represented in the media, Takahashi proposes these symbolize the acquisition of new identities and a desirable way of life, which are separate from the pressures even of traditional gender restrictions in Japanese society. So these are just a few of the studies that I've just marked out for here, but in general, studies such as these really highlight the ways in which gender positions are inseparable from other social identities that feed into language learning investments and outcomes, in particular educational contexts. So in the light of this discussion, and in order to introduce what is meant by a queer approach to applied linguistics, let's briefly return to some of the current debates in this field. And this has mainly involved a recent reconfiguring of what counts as language and how social, spatial, and material worlds interact vis-a-vis language problems in real-world contexts. So this has led to a kind of reconception by some applied linguistics, which may have been conventionally seen as a rather bounded discipline, to think that it's actually maybe more useful to think of applied linguistics less in like disciplinary or even transdisciplinary terms, but more, as Pennycook puts it, as a temporary assemblages of thought and action that come together at particular moments when language-related concerns need to be addressed. And Pennycook actually explains this reconception in the light of epistemic shifts. That is with reference to Foucault, by seeing epistemes as systems of thought that provide the conditions of possibility for discourse, thought, and action in different epochs. So in this way, the development of queer theory in recent decades represents one such epistemic shift, leading to the question that we're going to talk about here of how people working on or tackling language-related problems may usefully engage with the queer, in other words, the queering of the discipline of applied linguistics. So let's unpack this a bit by asking what is meant by the term queer, and more specifically, how this term relates to theory, linguistics, and of course, applied linguistics. And again, I'm not going to really go into much detail here, despite the complexity of the topic, but I hope I can provide a basic understanding of the term queer or queering at this time. So the word queer was, as many of you are probably aware, historically used as a slur in English-speaking contexts, but it underwent this process of resignification in the late 80s when it began to be used as a more positive marker to create a kind of broader constituency that includes anyone who goes against normality, irrespective of gender and sexual identification. And the word was later wed to the more respectable word theory, developing, of course, in the academic world into a critical enterprise that, as Jagose says, questions normative consolidations of sex, gender, and sexuality, and that consequently is critical of all those versions of identity, community, and politics that are believed to evolve naturally from such consolidations. So the focus is on normative consolidations in this definition by Jagose has pointed to the more or less subtle ways in which heteronormativity operates. In other words, queer theory seeks to deconstruct those structures, institutions, relations, and actions that promote and produce heterosexuality as natural, self-evident, desirable, privileged, and necessary. So queer linguistics thus emerged from queer theory to provide a focus on the linguistic manifestation of heteronormativity and connect it with binary gender and sexual identity discourses. So then, in this context, queer applied linguistics can be seen as a form of critical applied linguistics, which is applied to addressing social concerns, or, of course, language-related problems with inequalities around gender and sexuality. As Helen Saunson, who was one of the pioneers of what we might call a queer applied linguistics, as Helen Saunson proposed, this approach takes into account three main theoretical and overlapping issues. And these are temporality, seeing how discriminatory language practices around gender and sexuality are real-world problems that are also historical or temporal constructs. Spatiality, in that language problems are always bound to a particular space or place and are involved also in the construction of such spaces or places. And these are brought together to provide an understanding of how the very notion of normativity may shift in relation to temporal and spatial concepts. So, of course, this is all very theoretical here, but I hope to demonstrate in the case study that I'm going to talk about later, how time, space, and normativity can help with the interpretation of social action from a queer applied linguistic perspective or approach. But before doing that, I just wanted to again provide a brief overview of research that has deployed a queer applied linguistic approach. And a good place to start is with Helen Saunson and her study of language, sexuality, and education in the context of UK secondary schools. And in her analysis of the language of sexuality in this context, she highlights the real-world implications for policy and practice relating to schools in the UK. And so, with no real surprise, much of the work that takes a queer applied linguistic approach has been in language education, which of course is one of the traditional domains of applied linguistics. And this is especially in English language teaching and learning. And these approaches have been to investigate how issues of gender and sexuality can impact the language class in multiple ways. And even more specifically, how these kind of regulatory discourses of normative gender and sexuality may have been inhibiting opportunities for successful language learning, as well as shaping or even misshaping the socio-linguistic competencies needed for the successful navigation of the target culture, for example, in ESOL classes for recent immigrants to the West. So work of this kind has focused on classroom practices, on language learning textbooks, and teacher and student identities. But beyond the classroom, a seminal study by Brian King at HKU looked at how queer Korean male students sought out language learning opportunities through their relationships with English-speaking men. And this allowed them to access English-speaking social networks and provided them with the opportunity to learn the language informally and successfully. But also, in the interests of a queer approach, King also points out how discourses of sexuality in a globalized world, in this case, a very Western gay discourse that emphasizes individuality and self-expression, work to shape learners' desires and actions, but also restricted them. For example, one of King's participants found it very difficult to approach white men in the UK because of their powerful position in British society and therefore hindering language learning opportunities in the process. So after this very brief kind of overview, I'm going to move on to the case study that I want to present to you today. But before doing so, I just want to say that Brian's study was actually a great inspiration to me, and so much so that he actually ended up being my PhD supervisor. my interest really was also in issues of language learning and sexuality in Cambodia. And this was a place I'd visited as a tourist on multiple occasions, and I'd really been struck by the English competencies of local queer men. So in the remaining half of this talk, I want to demonstrate a queer applied linguistic approach via a case study of language socialization from my research in Cambodia. I'm going to be looking at some interview data from that study. And in this study, I was looking at the discursive and socio-pragmatic construction of same-sex relationship practices between local men and the visitors that they served in the queer ethnosexual contact zones of a tourist city there. So an ethnosexual contact zone is where people from different ethnicities come together in order to form relationships. So in these contact zones consisted of the bars, hotels, and spas, which were advertised to the tourists as gay friendly. So these relationships were often termed by locals and visitors alike as sponsorship arrangements. And they were defined across a spectrum. So this was from acts of charitable support, by which the Cambodian received economic support for education, to acts that appeared to be more or less transactional, where money was exchanged for friendship and in some cases sexual intimacy. Now, getting back to the applied linguistic approach, for this study, for this case study, I want to discuss the knowledges surrounding and informing these relationships in terms of learning. And this is by applying queer perspectives to processes of language socialization that were made relevant in the data. And by doing so, this is to demonstrate how these processes of language socialization brought access to multilingual resources circulating in these contact zones and beyond. And in this way, informed these socio-pragmatic competencies to understand sex or sexualities and relationship practices in this site of engagement. And this means also the potential to take action. Most importantly, and as you will see when I talk about the data, the sexual is caught up in narrated actions that are deeply entwined with the spatio-temporal context of their production, which is therefore my interest in the enactment of subject positions and epistemic stances across these kind of intersecting time-space scales in the data, and the learning trajectories that emerge as queer entanglements of knowledge to account for actions which were taken or resisted in this context. So here we can see that the space and the time is being made very relevant in this data. Okay, so let me give you a little bit of background on the position I took in this study and what I mean by queering the second language socialization paradigm in the light of this talk in queering applied linguistics. So second language socialization has its roots in, of course, language socialization research, which was developed in the early 80s. And this kind of research mainly focused on how children, through interaction with their caregivers and peers, acquired the linguistic skills together with the cultural knowledge to function in socially appropriate and linguistically intelligible ways in their communities and, of course, in their classrooms. And the scope of such research, particularly in second language learning and multilingualism, has moved towards kind of reevaluating the relationship of learners to learning environments beyond just institutions or classrooms, but in the co-occurring worlds and worldviews that constitute the current global era, and to explore how learning emerges wherever and whenever people interact in spaces that cross societal and personal borders. So in this way, this position also includes a directive to engage, like in critical applied linguistics, with broader dimensions of language learning, such as ideologies, identity, affect, and the socio-historical, economic, and political spaces and timescales within which linguistic resources are learned and deployed. So in this study, I attempted to bring further considerations to the language socialization paradigm through queer applied linguistic perspectives. And this was mainly to problematize the central tenets or epistemic categories of the language socialization paradigm by critically examining notions of identity and community, and in terms of methodology, to bring really to the fore considerations of how space or time is mobilized in second language socialization interview data. So by working from these queer perspectives, I also meant to draw attention not really to how participants may be socialized or not into what is understood in Western terms as an LGBT plus identity, but rather how these socially inscribed sexual identities and sexualities may be actually salient to the learning of local, but also translocal knowledges and actions in this case. And in particular, I want to show how the people I interviewed in my study are socialized through this ongoing semiotic production of time and place. And this is not least owing to the fact that learning will take place, of course, across and be impacted by multiple timescales, from the microsocial timescale of a particular interaction to the more macro-social timescales of institutions, history, and ideologies. So for the interview analysis I'm going to show in a minute, I examined participants, in this case one participant's invocation and discursive management of time-space frames in their narratives, according to the interplay between the story world, so the stories that they're telling, and the storytelling event, and the implications that these actions have with relation to these intersections and alignments between personal experiences and trajectories and these kind of broader socio-historical timelines. And finally, and in alignment with the queer perspectives that I'm working from, I position this study as being from the margins. And this is to kind of utilize this idea of margins as a heuristic lens through which knowledge production about particular socio-linguistic formations can be interrogated. And this position emphasizes that margins cannot be fixed or pinned down in terms of communities, identities, common sense, or value systems, but instead they're this kind of unsettling vantage point from which a queer eye, you can cast a queer eye on linguistic practices and performances that kind of lie uncomfortably with relation to normal or normative systems of understanding. And in this way, they have this potential to problematize or disrupt those very systems as well. And this is important to underline the limits of what is actually knowable. So the queer practices that emerge from the ethnographic fieldwork from which this study came from, thus work in the margins in this way to challenge kind of normative assumptions about language socialization and open up some space for reflection. Okay, so let me move on then to the data. So for this data, or for this analysis, I'm going to present some brief narrative accounts from one of the participants in my study, a Cambodian man who we'll call Bore, and he or his perspectives provide the case study for this presentation. So just a bit of information about Bore. Bore does not actually self-identify as a gay man, but he had been, when I knew him, in a close relationship with a gay male European resident of the city in which the study takes place. And through his personal and sometimes incidental engagement in the city's queer spaces, he relates his discoveries, his developing knowledges, and also his his meta-pragmatic awareness of how local or non-local sexualities intersect with transnational relationship practices here in this context. So the analytical focus is going to be on how Boré enacts subject positions and stances across these intersecting time-space scales. All right, let's have a look at an extract from this data. Okay, I'll just maybe give you a moment to read this before I give you some interpretation of it. I should say actually that this extract begins after another narrative, and in this narrative, Boré had told me that he had been very embarrassed at mistakenly assigning separate rooms to a gay tourist couple. This is while he was working as a hotel receptionist. So he'd been really embarrassed that this gay male couple, I'm assuming, came in and he had assigned them separate rooms. So despite in the story, he cited his ignorance of same gender desires, he'd actually told me he was admonished by his manager. So after this narrative, he responds to a question that I then asked about what he had learned about sexual identities from this encounter. So he begins his account here from the past, or in the past, from a kind of position of naivety. And this is via the construction of a stance in lines 5 to 10. And so he orients to his childhood in the countryside, in the village. And he says, I only know one boy and girl, men and women, no gays, no lesbians. So this kind of spatializing move between the rural and the urban works temporarily and also kind of analogously with Boré's crossing from inexperience to experience, or childhood to adulthood, where he encounters the language and bodies of non-normative sexuality for the first time in his workplace. And this kind of exemplifies spatialization and temporalization as these kind of indexical processes through which Boré, and of course people in general, invest space with social meaning. And in this way, it kind of establishes this relevance to the language socialization processes that emerge from his narrative. So the space of the hotel where this narrative is centered, this hotel, which is populated by visitors from all over the world, is mobilized in his story to contrast with the seemingly uncomplicated social world of his childhood. So this material and commercial space of the hotel also invokes this kind of higher order space-time scale, that of mass global tourism that impacts local lives and worldviews here in various ways. Okay, let's move on to another extract. So Boré actually didn't explain at this point what he learned about the meaning of gay, but he continued his story by recounting from the past a second encounter in the hotel, and this time with a single man who is positioned spatially as a European and thus indexed as foreign and different, and whom in the story he identifies as gay for the purposes of his developing account. So at this point in his story, it kind of signals a critical shift in the socialization narrative and his learning trajectory, where Boré actually recounts the interactions he had with this guest. So we pick up here from a proposition made by this guest who offers Boré a series of opportunities. And these offers are namely the provision of money for a university education in line 4, as you can see. So this is kind of a construction of an alternative and attractive future time space that is seemingly here contrasting with Boré's rather less desirable current position as a hotel worker in the narrative. So Boré interrupts this reported conversation to revisit again the subject of the guest's gay identity, an ongoing point of confusion which is made relevant within these socialization processes. And it's constructed here again as an epistemic stance. He says, I still don't know because I don't have experience. So this kind of incipient metapragmatic knowledge of the meaning of gay formed from conversations with his colleagues and is situated in this Cambodian space-time is very much reliant on the knowledges contained there. So what he learned about gay in the past is kind of disrupted by the guest's intentions, which is not only to support Boré, but financially, right? But also by bringing him to his country, as we can see in line 13. So in kind of making sense of Boré's socializing encounter with the hotel guest, it's really important to consider these intersecting space-time scales which are brought into play here. So apart from the material space of the hotel and the global tourism practices inscribed upon it, these altruistic provisions of the guest in Boré's story invoke and bring to bear on this space much broader scales. And this is actually what we could call, what is, I would say, Cambodia's recent past as it impacts the present. So this devastation that was wrought on Cambodian society by years of war and genocide have kind of resulted in this situation where foreign NGOs have established an abiding presence, working to alleviate poverty and empower local people through educational support and opportunity. So the hotel guest, and given the effective conditions they are confronted with when visiting Cambodia, the tourist is kind of implicated in and therefore socialized into these activities through, for example, volunteering at NGOs or donating to various causes. So this offer, which is made by the guest to Boré, therefore finds a kind of saliency or purpose within these broader historical timescales. In other words, as a potential sponsor who wants to help. So Boré's, we might call sexualized Cambodian body, can be seen in this way as a kind of semiotic artifact produced and contained within this particular place. And therefore his body is inscribed with a particular meaning, that is like someone who is attractive, who deserves to be helped and supported towards a better future. And it should be noted here, actually, that Boré did not take up this offer, and this actually resulted in his colleagues' disbelief for this missed opportunity. Okay, so in this final short extract, and in the light of the previous narrative, we just focus on a discussion that we later had about Boré's future prospects. And it should also be mentioned again at this point that despite Boré's missed sponsorship opportunity, he had found this relationship with this gay European man living in the city, who sponsored him for his daily living costs and education. So this extract begins after my reformulation of Boré's future plans that he'd previously explained that involved staying in Cambodia and starting his business. Okay. So after I'd asked this about starting his business, Boré interjected with this declarative statement that he wanted to help the children here. And I misinterpreted this statement by suggesting that he wants to get married and have children. So in this way, positioning Boré, about this temporal deictive in the future in line 3, and using this very heteronormative life path, probably again in the light of what I understood to be his heterosexual identity. So after a little brief negotiation of meaning in lines 4 to 5, Boré emphatically rejects my assumption in line 6 and explains, and I would say rather more queerly, that he wants to sponsor the children like the poor children in the village in lines 7 to 8. So it's in this statement that we see this trajectory coming full circle, where the socialization processes that Boré has drawn attention to in his previous talk, his trajectory traversing space-time, from the rural villages of his childhood, which he calls a very hard life, to the urban, and the knowledges of sponsorship practices he's developed and taken advantage of there is kind of mirrored in the intentions he states. So to this end, Boré is now kind of positioning himself as an expert. And he told me later that he'd started his own English school for local children, which met under the mango tree outside his home. So Boré's socialization into the language practices of sponsorship relationships through his engagement in the queer spaces of the city has kind of resulted in this recursive understanding that shifted to these kind of broader spatialities and temporalities. And that is really this ongoing development and future of Cambodia embodied in the figure of the multilingual child. So in the light of Boré's admission, we can see the queer spaces in which these transnational sponsorship practices are invested, crossing over into the perhaps more normative time spaces of citizenship, nationhood, development, and progress. So just to round up this short analysis, Boré's accounts, there are of course other accounts which I haven't had time to talk about here, but Boré's accounts have highlighted these dynamic processes of socialization because these learning trajectories he narrates traverse inexperience to insider status with respect to the sexualized relationship practices. So in this study, and this study therefore has been kind of tasked with exploring how aspects of the paradigm, the language socialization paradigm, can find this kind of theoretical and analytical traction when combined with queer applied linguistic approaches to studies of language and social practice. So this research has really been sought to engage with these notions of space, time, and place with respect to these processes of socialization, which are made relevant in Boré's narratives and in other participant narratives as well. And this has really been to focus attention on the places and these intersecting timescales that participants invoke to situate and make sense of their learning trajectories. So in particular, this approach to language socialization has emphasized the social meanings invested in the bodies, in the practices, and the other semiotic artifacts that these places and timescales contain. So to this end, this kind of analytical attention to the learning trajectories allowed me as a researcher to make sense of this relationship practice of sponsorship. So in other words, I couldn't really see these practices just solely in terms of sexual transaction or sex work. So just summing up, the narrative accounts that I selected and analyzed in this study, I mean, they're partial and incomplete, of course, and there's always alternative questions that would engender alternative narratives. But the queer applied linguistic research position that I adopted from the margins as heuristic is not really to seek for universals or all-encompassing explanations of what's going on. By contrast, it's this position from which to ask these difficult or troubling questions, to problematize assumptions and to create a queer space that allows for both possibilities and often uncomfortable reflection. So like this, the queering of the LS paradigm and queering applied linguistics more generally kind of finds currency, I think, with applied linguistic projects that aim to queer multilingualism more generally. And this is by kind of foregrounding and unraveling the complexities of multilingual language or social practices as these relate to and challenge heteronormative assumptions. And in other words, this is really to take seriously how multiple languages, gendered and sexualized bodies, temporalities, spatialities, and materialities intersect in diverse arenas of social action. Okay, so after all that, let's end. with some thoughts about a querying of applied linguistics in general, and some potential ways forward, I think, for this approach. So firstly, by approaching language-related problems or practices in real-world contexts, we need to be mindful of how our approaches need to be constantly evolving, of course, and very much open to critical development, as Sorensen says. And this means, of course, engaging always with these broader epistemic shifts and approaching any queer applied linguistic study with a keen eye, for example, on how like discursive materializations of sexualities relate to political economies. And I think that's a relation that we've seen clearly in the case study that I've presented. And this also, of course, means attention to how various social categories and positions intersect in and impact on social arenas and practices / problems. In addition, there's certainly much more room for studies that move away from these kind of more traditional spaces of applied linguistics, like classrooms, okay, and engage with diverse spaces of social action. So just some shameless self-promotion here, but I've been looking at how a language of sexual diversity is negotiated in the NGO space. And I've got a publication coming out soon on this. And actually, I guess more broadly, I mean, this approach should be relating to how people on the ground, how they actually approach these prevailing conceptions of gender or sexuality and the related discourses. And so we should be asking how a queer applied linguistics might actually mediate between folk and academic language-related theories. And that's something, again, more shameless self-promotion. Sorry, I'm looking at in my study of the Hong Kong Gay Games, how volunteers who are working for the Gay Games are engaging in this act of queering what it means to be gay. Finally, I think we need to stress the importance of constant critical reflexivity as researchers, as we're navigating between our own research agendas and the social worlds in which we operate. So how might, for example, our desires within a queer applied linguistic approach or an approach from the margins, our desires for social transformation be construed, actually construed by those with whom we're working? And how might tensions arise and how might they potentially be addressed? Okay, that's all I want to say. I'm sorry it's been quite a long and very theoretically heavy presentation, but I hope that you got something from it. Thank you so much for your kind attention. I guess we have some time for any questions or comments. And if you want to contact me about it or have anything, please do contact me at my email address here. Thank you.